Jimi Hendrix touched the guitar. And everyone in the room understood something had shifted irreversibly. Keith included. London. Late autumn, 1967. A small rehearsal space above a pub in Soho. The kind of room musicians rented by the hour, scuffed wooden floors, amp cables coiled in corners, cigarette burns on the windowsill, the faint smell of beer drifting up from the bar below. 6 people in the room. Maybe 7. No one could remember the exact count later. What they remembered was the moment. The shift. The silence that followed. Keith Richards sat on a folding chair, legs stretched out, his Gibson in his lap. He'd been playing for the last 20 minutes, showing off, maybe, though he'd never admit it. Open G tuning. His signature. The tuning that made honky-tonk women possible, that gave the Stones their swagger, that separated him from every other guitarist trying to sound American while sitting in England. He was good. Everyone knew it. Keith knew it. Jimi Hendrix sat across from him on an amp case, listening. Not performing. Not holding a guitar. Just listening with that distant expression he sometimes had, like he was hearing something beyond the notes, something in the spaces between. Someone, a session player whose name is lost to time, had made a joke. Something about open G being a real player's tuning, or how most guitarists couldn't handle it, because it required rethinking everything. Keith smiled at that. Took a drag from his cigarette. Kept playing. And then someone said it. The words that would define the next 3 minutes and haunt Keith Richards for decades. Bet Jimmy couldn't play that tuning. It wasn't meant as a challenge. Not really. Just conversation. Banter. The kind of thing musicians say to each other in small rooms when the night stretches long and the bourbon runs low. But Keith stopped playing. He looked at Jimmy. Raised an eyebrow. Extended his guitar across the small space between them. You ever mess with open G, mate? Jimmy looked at the offered guitar. Then at Keith. His expression didn't change. No smile. No frown. Just that quiet, unreadable face. Not much, Jimmy said softly. His voice was always softer than people expected. Gentle. Like he was sharing a secret instead of having a conversation. It's a different animal, Keith said, warming to the moment now, unable to resist the opportunity to hold court on his own expertise. Takes years to really understand it. Everything you know, standard tuning, chord shapes, it's all upside down in open G. You have to forget and relearn. Jimmy nodded slowly. Reached out. His fingers touched the guitar's neck. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The room went quiet without anyone deciding to be quiet. One of those organic silences that happens when people sense something is about to occur. Jimmy settled the Gibson across his lap. His hands moved over it with strange gentleness, like he was greeting an old friend, not picking up an unfamiliar instrument in an unfamiliar tuning. He plucked a string. Listened. Adjusted his grip. Keith leaned back in his chair, cigarette dangling from his lips, waiting for the fumbling that inevitably happened when guitarists tried to navigate open G for the first time. Waiting for Jimmy to sound like every other player who touched that tuning and struggled. Jimmy's fingers found the fretboard. And he played. Not fast. Not flashy. Not trying to impress anyone. He played 3 notes. Just 3. Slow. Deliberate. With space between each one. Keith's cigarette stopped halfway to his mouth. The thing about those 3 notes, the thing that made them impossible to forget, was that they were perfectly, impossibly right. Not just correct for the tuning. Not just technically accurate. They were right in a way that suggested Jimmy hadn't learned open G in that moment. He'd understood it. Instantly. Completely. In the 3 seconds between touching the guitar and playing those notes, Jimi Hendrix had absorbed what Keith Richards spent years mastering. But that wasn't the devastating part. The devastating part was what Jimmy did next. He took Keith's signature tuning, the thing Keith had built his entire musical identity around, and played it like it was a language he'd always spoken. Like open G wasn't a specialized skill but a natural dialect he simply hadn't bothered with before because he had other things to say. The melody that emerged was nothing Keith had ever played. Nothing Keith had ever thought to play. It was bluesy but not traditional blues. It was rhythm but it breathed. It was simple but it contained universes. Jimi played for maybe 90 seconds. No one in the room moved. No one spoke. They just listened while Jimi Hendrix casually dismantled the idea that tunings were territories, that techniques were possessions, that any approach to the guitar could be owned. When Jimi stopped, the silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was the silence of understanding, of realization, of ego quietly collapsing under the weight of something larger than competition. Jimi handed the guitar back to Keith. His expression hadn't changed. Still gentle. Still quiet. "Nice tuning," Jimi said simply. Keith took the guitar back. Looked down at it. His hands, the hands that had played open G 1,000 times, that had defined it for a generation, suddenly felt uncertain on the neck. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He stood up from the amp case. Stretched slightly. Started to reach for his jacket like the moment was over, like nothing significant had happened, like he hadn't just redefined the ceiling of what was possible. "Wait," Keith said. His voice was rougher than usual. "How did you?" He stopped. "Because how do you finish that question? How did you learn my tuning in 3 seconds? How did you play it better than me? How did you make me feel like a beginner in the thing I thought I'd mastered?" Jimi paused, jacket half on. Looked back at Keith. "There's no wrong way to find notes," Jimi said quietly. "Tuning is just a suggestion. The guitar doesn't care. It'll give you whatever you're ready to hear." It was the kind of statement that could sound pretentious. That should have sounded pretentious. But the way Jimi said it, soft, matter-of-fact, like he was describing the weather, made it sound like the simplest truth in the world. Keith stared at him. Then down at his guitar. Then back at Jimi. "Show me something else," Keith said. Not a question. Almost a plea. Jimi smiled then. Just slightly. Not triumphant. Not superior. Just warm. "You already know it, man," Jimi said. "You're just asking the guitar for permission. You don't need permission." He finished putting on his jacket. Nodded to the other musicians in the room, all of whom were still frozen, still processing what they'd witnessed. "I got a split," Jimi said. "Early session tomorrow." And he left. Just walked out of the rehearsal room, down the stairs, into the London night, leaving behind 6 or 7 musicians who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what had just happened. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Keith Richards sat alone for a long time after everyone else had gone. The Gibson was still in his lap. Open G. His tuning. His signature. His identity. He played the same progression he'd been playing before Jimi arrived. The same notes. The same rhythm. But they sounded different now. Not worse. Not better. Just limited. Like he'd been playing inside a box and hadn't realized the box existed until someone showed him the walls. Keith would tell this story later, in interviews, always with the same careful wording. "Jimi didn't compete with you. He didn't show off. He just existed at a level that made you realize you'd been playing guitar wrong your whole life. Not technically wrong. Conceptually wrong. The thing Keith never fully explained, because how could he, was the specific feeling of that moment. The feeling of holding your instrument and suddenly understanding that you don't possess it. It possesses nothing. It's neutral. A tool. And what you get from it depends entirely on what you're brave enough to ask. Jimi hadn't humiliated Keith. Hadn't tried to. Hadn't even seemed aware that what he'd done was remarkable. He just played. And in playing, revealed that mastery wasn't about territory. It was about surrender. The next day, Keith went into the studio with the Stones. They were working on Jumpin' Jack Flash. Standard session. Standard approach. Keith plugged in, set up his open G tuning, started to play the opening riff. And stopped. Something was different. He was asking the guitar different questions. Looking for different answers. The riff that emerged, the riff that would become one of the Stones' most iconic tracks, had a looseness to it that Keith's playing had never quite had before. A willingness to let the notes breathe instead of controlling them. Mick asked him what changed. Keith didn't answer. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. Years later, in 1970, Keith was in a session and someone mentioned Jimi's death. September 18th. London. Gone at 27. Keith had to leave the studio. Went outside. Sat on the curb with his Gibson. He tuned it to open G. Played those same 3 notes Jimi had played that night in Soho, slow. Deliberate. With space between each one. They still sounded impossibly right. A session player came outside, someone who'd been in that rehearsal room 3 years earlier. Sat down next to Keith without speaking. After a while he said, "You ever figure out how he did that? How he just understood it instantly?" Keith was quiet for a long time. Then, "He didn't understand the tuning. He understood the guitar. There's a difference." Another pause. "Most of us spend our whole lives learning techniques. Jimi didn't learn techniques. He listened. And the guitar told him everything." The session player nodded. "You think he knew? How good he was?" Keith shook his head. "I don't think Jimi thought about good. He just thought about honest. He played honest. The rest of us play correct." In 1987, Keith Richards was interviewed for a documentary about influential guitarists. The interviewer asked him to name the moment he realized he wasn't the best. Keith smiled. "Soho, 1967. Small rehearsal room. Jimi Hendrix played my tuning better than me in 90 seconds. Didn't gloat. Didn't showboat. Just played. And left. And I sat there knowing I just watched someone who lived on a completely different plane." The interviewer asked if it bothered him. Keith thought about it. "No. It freed me. Because I stopped trying to be the best. Started trying to be honest. Jimi taught me that without meaning to. Just by existing." Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The guitar Jimi played that night, Keith's Gibson, was sold at auction in 2003. The buyer was a collector who wanted it because Keith Richards had played it on several Stones records. Keith sent the buyer a letter. In it he wrote, "That guitar was touched by Jimi Hendrix for 90 seconds in 1967. Those 90 seconds changed how I understood music for the next 50 years. Whatever you paid, you got a bargain." The letter is framed next to the guitar. And sometimes, late at night, when the museum is empty, the security guards swear they can hear 3 notes. Slow. Deliberate. With space between each one. Impossibly right. There's a footnote to this story that few people know. In 1992, Keith Richards was teaching his son how to play guitar. The boy was frustrated, struggling with bar chords, ready to quit. Keith stopped him. Put down his own guitar. Told him about that night in Soho. About Jimi. About the 3 notes that changed everything. "Your problem," Keith said to his son, "is you're trying to control the guitar. Like it's a contest. Like you have to win." The boy looked confused. "Isn't that the point? To get good?" Keith shook his head. "Getting good means learning to listen. The guitar is already speaking. Most people spend their whole lives talking over it. Jimi knew how to shut up and listen." He picked up the guitar, handed it to his son. "Play me 1 note. Just 1. But make it honest." The boy played a single note. Tentative. Uncertain. "Again," Keith said. "But this time, don't try to make it sound like anything. Just let it exist." The boy played again. Something shifted. Not in the technique. In the intention. Keith nodded. That's it. That's what Jimi understood at 24 that most guitarists never understand at 60. The guitar doesn't need you to be impressive. It needs you to be present. Years later, that same son, now a musician himself, was asked in an interview about his biggest musical influence. He didn't name his father. He named a man he never met, whose playing he'd only heard on records, who died 22 years before he was born. Jimi Hendrix, he said. Because my dad told me a story about 3 notes. And those 3 notes taught me that music isn't about what you can do. It's about what you're willing to hear. The interviewer asked him to explain. He couldn't. Not really. How do you explain the weight of silence? How do you describe the sound of someone listening so deeply that the instrument surrenders its secrets? All I know, he said finally, is that somewhere in London in 1967, Jimi Hendrix touched my father's guitar for 90 seconds. And 50 years later, I'm still learning what that means. The room where it happened, that small rehearsal space above the Soho pub, was demolished in 1995. Turned into luxury flats. No plaque. No marker. Nothing to indicate that a moment of quiet mastery once occurred there. But musicians still know. They know the address. They know the story. And sometimes, when they're struggling, when they're trying too hard, when they've forgotten why they started playing in the first place, they think about Keith Richards handing Jimi Hendrix a guitar in open G. They think about 3 notes. Slow. Deliberate. With space between each one. And they remember, the instrument doesn't owe you anything. But if you listen, really listen, it will tell you everything.